Hey, sorry about that, guys. My microphone went out all of a sudden, so I had to stop the recording and fix it real quick. Anyway, back to where we were. So the way that we get more diversity into our populations can come one of many ways. So we can have individuals migrating in or emigrating out. We can have competition for mates, and so this kind of selective pressure can really shape and form behavior. If you think about a peacock, like the males don't look like that because they think it's awesome. They look like that because the females prefer it. And so over the course of time, the showier, bigger males, the ones that had like the really awesome feathers, those are the ones that the females chose to mate with, and so therefore those genes got passed down. Sexual dimorphism, which is a trait that differs between males and females, also can increase diversity, and sexual selection. So individuals that are better at securing mates are going to have more babies than others. I mean, that just kind of goes without saying. The biggest, most fit, sexiest peacock out there is the one that's going to get to mate with all the females. So in some populations, you guys are probably more familiar with this than you think. Some populations, males compete for access to groups of females, and so like bighorn sheep do this, elephant seals do this, where the females just kind of like hang out and they're just like, whatever, what's going on, and the males fight with each other until one of them eventually is the winner, and then that male gets to mate with all the females. And so again, there's still competition there, and the males are fighting for access to all the females. So balanced polymorphism, this is when you've got two or more gene alleles that continue circulating at a relatively high frequency in a population. I'll show you guys some examples of that here in a second. And then frequency-dependent selection, this is where you've got an adaptive value for a particular form of a trait that depends on its frequency in a population. And again, I'll show you this in a second. Genetic drift, this is when you've got a random change in an allele frequency over time. Generally, this is brought about because of like an ecological disaster. So, like, let's say that you've got a population of frogs, okay? And half of them are green, half of them are brown, or whatever. And then you have a volcano erupt and it takes out like 90% of the population, and it just so happened that it took out 90% of the green ones and only 10% of the brown ones. So now, because you've got mostly brown ones left, that's what they're talking about with genetic drift. It's that random change in an allele's frequency brought about by a chance event, like a volcano exploding or a flood or something like that. Usually it's an ecological disaster. When you've got a fixed allele, this is when you've got a population of individuals that only are homozygous for that allele. Okay? So the frequency doesn't change unless there's a mutation or unless another individual of the same species enters the population that has different alleles. So that's what that looks like graphically, which is kind of crazy. So this is where you've got some allele frequencies. So this is the frequency of a B+ allele. And so you can see it's going down, it's going up. And so this is the size of the population was maintained at 10 breeding individuals. So the allele B+ was lost in one population, and so you can see that one like lands at 0 here. And then it says the size of this population was maintained at 100 individuals, so it's 10 times greater than this one. And so drift in these populations is less. So if there's an ecological disaster or something, drift is going to be less because you've got more individuals. And so obviously ecological disaster is going to be a lot more problematic for a small population than for a large one. So a bottleneck effect, this is something that happens relatively frequently actually. It's happened to the human population, like when the bubonic plague swept through Western Europe. It's happened to cheetahs just recently. We killed off almost all of them, and so only those individuals that were left have the alleles that can be passed down to future generations. And so the drastic reduction in a population size, whether that's because of disease or hunting or because of an ecological disaster, can greatly reduce genetic diversity, and that kind of goes without saying because like you've lost a big chunk of your population. So an example of this that they give you in your book that's outside of like cheetahs or humans is the northern elephant seals. So these guys were hunted until the population was reduced to 20 individuals. That's crazy to me. So 20 individuals, that's it. And so population have recovered because we've had like major hunting restrictions and because these animals were like critically endangered for a second. And so those 20 individuals are all that's left. They have all the alleles that can now be passed down at all, like period. And so that's the bottleneck, is where you had probably a population of probably 20,000. If you kill off, 99.99% of them and you're left with 20, it's just those 20 individuals that have all the alleles left that can now go to their offspring. So the founder effect is kind of like a bottleneck effect, except this is when you have a small group of individuals that starts a new population. So the new individuals, the small group of individuals that start a new population, that's all the alleles that you got for that new population, because they carry everything that can be possibly passed down. Inbreeding also can affect allele frequencies and also kind of keep them stable in a way. But this is breeding between close relatives. For mammals, this is not good. Plants really like to do this, and it doesn't seem to harm them at all, so that's fine. But this results in an unusually high percentage of individuals that are homozygous for recessive alleles. The Tudors are a good example of this, like the royal family in England. They had problems with an X-linked disease called hemophilia in their males, but that's because they were under the impression that keeping the blood in the family was a good idea, and so very commonly like cousins would get married, or a niece and an uncle would get married and have children, and so there was all this inbreeding in the royal family, and so they had a very high rate of hemophilia, which is a relatively rare sex-linked genetic disorder, but because there was so much inbreeding in that family, it was not so rare. So gene flow is just moving of genes from one population to another. Okay, so this is just, you have a population of red squirrels in one location, and you have a population of, I don't know, reddish-brown squirrels that are the same species but maybe just slightly different, and then they move back and forth between the populations, and they're bringing their new alleles with them. So this is just movement of alleles between populations. So speciation, this can occur in a variety of different ways, but this is just an evolutionary process in which new species are going to form. This occurs when populations do not interbreed. So if there's interbreeding going on, that means that you're never going to speciate, because you're constantly just replenishing that supply of alleles from everybody else. And so the number of genetic differences is going to increase. And over time, over a long time, these two groups of individuals are going to become different enough that we can call them a different species. So there are several different ways that a new species can kind of crop up, and one of those ways is called reproductive isolation. And so reproductive isolation is a way that we can start a new species, because individuals from one population will stop breeding with individuals of another. Temporal isolation kind of prevents interbreeding because of timing of reproduction differs. A really good example of this are like little peepers, like the little frogs that we have here. There's several different species of frogs that just do their breeding activities at different times. And so one species will do breeding maybe in April, another species will do breeding maybe in May, another species will do breeding in August or something like that. And because the females are interested in breeding at different times, the males and all these different species are going to become speciated. They're going to become different because they can't breed together anymore because of this temporal isolation. Ecological isolation occurs when you've got interbreeding that's prevented because of adaptation to different microenvironments. An example of this would be like barnacles, those little crusty things that grow on the underside of your boat, or they grow on rocks and stuff. They're little crustaceans, and some of them grow best in an intertidal zone. Some of them grow best underwater that's not going to be out of water part of the day. And so because of that little split, that little difference in where they like to live, they're not going to breed together. Behavioral isolation is where you've got differences in behavior that prevent mating. And so if a species of birds, for example, that maybe are very similar, but maybe one species of bird has a very specific mating call, and then the other species of bird has a slightly different mating call, the females are very highly attuned to this, and so they're not going to breed with a male unless their mating or their courtship behaviors are in line with what they're expecting. Mechanical isolation is when your reproductive stuff doesn't fit. So a lot of insects run into this problem where they've got like these lock and key mechanisms for breeding. And so if the male stuff doesn't fit in the female stuff, then you can't mate, right? So if it doesn't fit, there's like no play, it's not going to work. And so there are other things called post-zygotic or pre-zygotic and post-zygotic barriers to reproduction. And so some of those can mean that you can have sex, like you can actually get the business part of that done, and you can get in there and your sperm can meet with an egg cell, but the gametes have molecular incompatibility, so like different numbers of chromosomes, for example, and so a baby is never formed. So even though you had a copulatory event and you had sex, there's not going to be a baby that's going to result from that union. And a lot of time, even if you have two different species that can breed and they can make an offspring, a lot of times those hybrid offspring have reduced fitness. And so probably the classic example of this is a mule. So that's a horse and a donkey. They can have babies together, even though I think they have different numbers of chromosomes. But the resultant offspring, which is called a mule, is sterile. They can't have babies. And so these are different types of reproductive isolating mechanisms that can drive speciation. So you guys can go in there. This is just a nice way to kind of like summarize all of that. Okay, so other types of speciation outside of that reproductive speciation include allopatric speciation, and so this is where you've got physical separation between populations. So there might be geographic barriers, like a mountain range or an ocean or something that's preventing these populations from interbreeding. This is especially important in what are called archipelagos, which are newly formed island chains. And so allopatric speciation is very common on islands that are really, really far away from any sort of mainland. So like Hawaii is home to a lot of different types of birds and plants and other organisms that you find nowhere else on Earth. And that's because they were these small groups of organisms were kind of like blown over by the wind, or they were brought over with boats or something like that. And because there was no competition for these organisms, because nothing else was living there at the time, they were able to speciate very quickly. This is an example of allopatric speciation. So these little guys are like little shrimpy guys, and so one of them lives on one side of this little bottom part here of like Central America. So one lives on this side, one lives on this side. So you can see that they're similar, but they're not quite the same. So probably what happened here is that they were separated by this landmass at some point in their evolution, and because they've been separated for so long, they're starting to look different. So sympatric speciation is when you've got organisms that live in the same place at the same time, but they're speciating anyway. And so they're living basically on top of each other, but they're going to speciate anyway. So parapatric speciation is where you've got adjacent populations that speciate despite being in contact across that common border. So they still like kind of live close to each other. And so these divergent events are spurred by local selection pressures, and then they become reinforced. So an example of this is a velvet walking worm. I put a picture here because I have never seen a velvet walking worm, and I was curious, and so I thought you might be too. So these little guys, the giant velvet walking worms, and the blind walking worms can interbreed, but their hybrid offspring are sterile. And so even though they're living close to one another and they can breed together, a new species is not going to come about because of their offspring. And instead what's happened is the walking velvet worms and the blind walking worms have already speciated to the point where their offspring are going to be sterile. Okay, so macroevolution. Macro means big, so macroevolution just means like a bunch of these little tiny tweaks and changes to populations over a large period of time. And so this is evolutionary patterns on a very large scale. And so a good example of this is land plants evolving from green algae. They evolved originally from green algae, but now they're so different that, and we still have green algae all over the place, but now we also have all this diversity of life that's included in the Plantae kingdom as well. When you hear stasis, think static, and so this just means that there's not a lot of change over a long period of time. Cockroaches are basically the same that they have like in the fossil record, like they're basically the same. Same thing with alligators and crocodiles. There have been very, 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 very few evolutionary changes, and what that tells us is that those organisms are already really well adapted to their environment, and there hasn't really been a lot of pressure for them to change. Axaptation is adapting to an existing structure for a new purpose. So bats are probably a really good example of this, because at one point they were flightless, okay, and eventually over the course of time, like, their arms grew those flaps on them, and they were able to use them for flight. And so that's, again, adapting an existing structure for a new purpose. Adaptive radiation is where you've got basically a founder effect, and this happens a lot of times on islands. This is where you have a small group of organisms, like one lineage, that rapidly diverges into several new species. And usually this is because there is a lot of niches that are available for these organisms to take advantage of. And so honey creepers on Hawaii are a good example, because all the different types of honey creepers on Hawaii diverged very quickly, speciated very quickly, when there was one species of honey creeper that originally got onto the island, but now there's multiple species, because all these birds had so many different resources that they could exploit. And so key innovation, this is when a new trait that allows its bearer to exploit a habitat more efficiently or in a very new way. And so the evolution of lungs is probably the most classic example of this. So now, because we've got lungs, we are not relegated to the water anymore. We can come up on land, and we can go do stuff, and we can walk around, and we can do things. And so the having of lungs enabled mammals and amphibians and lizards and all these other reptilian organisms, allowed us to come out of the water and exploit the terrestrial environment, because now we're not relegated to the water for our gaseous exchange. So in coevolution, this is where you've got two species that are evolving jointly, okay? So that means that the evolution of one is going to impact the evolution of the other. So there's a very close interaction here. There are lots of examples of this in nature. One that's coming to mind just for me is an orchid and then a long-tongued moth. The long-tongued moth has got this really long proboscis, and it's the only organism that can pollinate these long-tubed orchids. And so as the orchid made a longer tube, it put pressure on the moth to have a longer proboscis, and so they evolved kind of together. Okay, so here's your points to ponder. Think about those on your own. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you guys next week.